What's going on, guys? I'm Pete, and this is Retro Game Addict. So if you're into retro gaming or familiar with this channel, chances are you know the legendary Sony Trinitron CRT TV. They're pretty well respected and they need no introduction. But there is another line of CRT TVs by Sony from back then, the Sony Watchman, which is the portable CRT TV variant. They're pretty cool little nifty units for their time. I picked it up for $1 at a yard sale, so I figured why not hook up some retro consoles to it. So without further ado, let's get into it. First thing you can see right off the bat is that it's not in color, it's actually in black and white, so it's going to be a little hard to see regardless. And this particular model of TV, it's kind of weird how the CRT is situated. It actually is projecting upwards, and the screen that you're viewing is actually a mirror that's angled so it reflects the image to you. And it's going to take a little bit of an adjustment to get a decent picture. Luckily, there is a tuning dial on there, so you can kind of just fine tune it as you go. And I'm using an American top-loader NES. So given that the North American top-loader NES has RF output only, I'm going to use that to my advantage and directly hook up the NES RF unit to the top of the TV via a coaxial to 3.5mm adapter, so there's no need for a modulator or converter or anything like that. And that 3.5mm input is right on top of the TV and is labeled external antenna. The picture is kind of wonky. There's a bit of fuzziness and static. This is an old TV, so it could be a number of things. It could be the antenna port itself, the 3.5mm adapter, the coaxial cable I'm using, the NES RF adapter, and so on. But I kind of fine-tuned it to the best of my ability, and it looks decent enough. And the first game we're trying out here is Super Mario Bros. 3. I know this game like the back of my hand, and it has a bright color palette, at least in the first couple of levels, so it should be easier to see on a black and white TV like this. And the video doesn't do it justice, but the sound output on this old Watchman TV is actually pretty solid for 1985. It's somewhat playable, but like I said, I know this game so well, so even with a bit of a visual impairment, I'm not having too much trouble navigating around. And it's hard to notice from the video, but given that this TV has just a tiny 2-inch screen, the sprites are super tiny, so it's kind of cool to see in person. The video really doesn't do it justice. And we're progressing through the level here. I'm not going to go nuts. So we tried Super Mario Bros. 3, let's try another game on the NES, and I'm going to go with Battletoads, because that's another game that I played to death when I was a kid, and I know it super well. The first level of Battletoads doesn't have a super bright color palette, so it's going to be interesting to see how it looks on this black and white TV. And that distortion is going to be a common theme here, but I do have a bit of an advantage since I do know it so well. I'm just going to play up to the first boss here, and we'll defeat the enemies as we go. And I died a few times, which can be blamed on my abilities, but it really is just, it's kind of hard to see on this TV. And I've always loved that first-person view from the boss's perspective in this game. It was super innovative back then, and it still holds up today. And here's a little bit more of that Battletoads gameplay before we move on to the next game. So let's try another system. I'm going to be using a Sega Genesis Model 1 with AV cables. So in order to hook up the Genesis to the Watchman, I'm using a UHF modulator. It's an AV to RF converter. I just plug the Genesis into the RF in, and then there's an RF out coaxial cable that's going to go to the TV via the 3.5mm jack on the top. And then the modulator has a certain channel that it will output in, and then I actually tune into it onto the TV. So it's kind of like broadcasting a little signal that the TV's picking up via its analog antenna. It's not a super clear picture, and we're still getting the same interference as we were getting before, so maybe it does have something to do with the connection on the top of it. But again, I don't know, and I'm not really going to look too much into it. It's playable enough, and let's get into it. So we'll try ToeJam and Earl, The Panic on Funkotron. I never had this game as a kid, and given that, I'm not familiar, and let's just dive into it and see if I can navigate around with this bad or subpar picture. I mean, I can kind of barely see anything. I know the lighting's changed a little bit here. I'm going with a darker background to see if that's going to work with the contrast. I don't think it's working out too well in my favor. The sound output is fine. I'm moving around here. I'm just progressing right, and I have no idea what I'm doing. And now going into this blind, whereas the other two games I tried before I know pretty well, it really isn't that playable, and it's super hard to make out. It's a little bit clearer in person, and the video kind of degrades it a little bit, but it's really not much clearer in person. Or not that much more playable for that matter. Alright, I can barely see what's going on here. I guess I fell down. I don't know what I'm doing. So enough with the Genesis. Let's move on to the Super Nintendo. And again, I'm using the AV hookup and then just transmitting it through the RF modulator to the TV. And the first game we'll try here is Super Mario All-Stars, and I'm going to try the original Super Mario Bros. Another game I know like the back of my hand. That was actually the first game I ever had when I was a kid. So a little bit of a home team advantage here. It looks pretty good. Again, those bright colors give it a little bit more of an advantage. I know gaming on a black and white TV is not ideal, and I only did it for a little bit when I was a kid and never looked back. but that's just how we did it back in the 90s. And I'll just show a little bit more of the level here before we move on to the next game. The next game I'm going to try here is Donkey Kong Country for the Super Nintendo. I played it a decent amount when I was a kid, and I don't know it as well as the others I've played so far. And those silicon graphics are kind of muddled and dark, so it's going to be interesting to see how they look on this black and white TV. Sound output is great, as always, so far. It was a little hard in the Overworld to see even where the heck I was, but I eventually got to somewhere. And it's good with these old side-scroller games. Obviously, you're going to go right a lot of the times, and you can kind of make out the enemies. It's a little hard to see. I'm dying a lot, so I really don't know what I'm doing. The multi-layered parallax scrolling actually looks pretty good on the Super Nintendo with this little black and white TV, but this one's almost virtually unplayable, which seems to be a common theme here for games that I'm not super familiar with. But enough with the Super Nintendo, let's move on to the N64, and we'll try one of my favorites here, which is Wave Race 64. I adjusted the brightness for this segment a little bit, just to see if it would make it a little bit easier to see. And when playing it in person, I kind of felt that Wave Race at least was easier to see, probably because it's so bright and a lot of water and blue shading. And I thought out of all the games so far, Wave Race was actually the easiest to see on the screen in person, so it's going to be interesting to see how I progress. We'll select the watercraft. And yeah, I'm crashing, I'm going off course. I'm not doing super well here. But screw it, let's move on to the championship and see how we can do. And I did horrible. Going off course, crashing into things. And this is another game that I played a ton as a kid, and I still can't get anywhere in it. And I'll show off the gameplay a little bit more right here, just so you can check it out, before we move on to the next one. Alright, so the final game we're going to show off here is Pokemon Snap for the N64. And this is another one that I'm not super familiar with. I played it maybe a handful of times. I played the Switch version and I beat it, which I thought was cool, but I never got into the 64 version when it came out. I kind of did like a reverse child thing. I got into Pokemon when I was like 30. And yeah, it's super hard to see what's going on. Luckily, this isn't a fast-paced game or anything, so I thought it would be a little bit easier to play on this TV. In a game that focuses on getting the best visuals and pictures, I mean, this TV is just not going to work out for it. But it is handling it better than I thought it would. And there's minimal interference on the N64 versus the other systems, so maybe it has something to do with like the power output or just some sort of interference, I guess, coming from one of the other consoles. I don't know. But regardless, the image seems to be a little bit more stable on the N64 games. And that was some retro gaming on a 2-inch portable Sony Watchman TV. As you can see, this TV is not ideal for any sort of gaming, even though there's probably better methods out there to get a better visual output from it. Sure, the games were all able to be viewed, but I did have a tough time playing the ones that I wasn't super familiar with. Either way, I thought it was pretty cool to try out though. So what did you guys think? I'm sure some of you have ideas how to get better visuals from it. But even if you don't, please drop me a message in the comments and let me know what you think. I love hearing from you guys. As always, thank you so much for checking out Retro Game Attic. I seriously appreciate you all. Stay retro, and I'll catch you on the next one. Later.